or Chapter 19, Towards an Urban Society, 1877 to 1900. America's cities grew rapidly between 1860 and 1910. This chapter explains who came and why, and describes the often horrendous living conditions associated with rapid urbanization. The lure of the city. Between 1870 and 1900, the city became a symbol of a new America. Skyscrapers and suburbs. The use of steel beams allowed architects to rise buildings to previous impossible heights, and streetcars allowed those with sufficient wealth to move from the crowded city centers. Skyscrapers and suburbs became the defining characteristic of the American cities. Tenement and problem with overcrowding. To house the enormous number of people crowded into the central cities, a new form of structure, the tenement, was created. Inadequate sanitation, air and water pollution, the stench of factories and human waste made the cities dangerously unhealthy. In addition, cities suffered high rates of juvenile crime, suicide, and alcoholism. Strangers in a new land. The cities were populated by millions of immigrants who came to the United States in the late 19th century, but by 1900, the vast majority of people who lived in New York, Boston, or Chicago were foreign-born or were children of immigrants. Nativism again became a strong force, especially in the 1880s, when a new immigration from southern and eastern Europe brought millions of Italians, Slavs, Greeks, and Jews into the country. Organizations such as the American Protective Association tried to limit immigration, but without much success. Immigrants in the city. European peasants faced the difficult task of becoming American factory workers, but while doing so, they retained much of their traditional ways of life and shaped the city as much as the city shaped them. Immigrants tended to marry within their own ethnic groups, and they tended to marry later and have more children than did native-born Americans. Immigrant associations helped preserve the language and customs of the old country while aiding in the process of adjustment to the new country. All immigrant groups started their own newspapers, their own churches or synagogues, and their own schools, all of which institutions helped preserve traditions. The house that Tweed built. Political power in the cities was shared by various institutions, including party machines headed by bosses. Some of these men, like William Tweed of New York City, were notoriously corrupt, but most merely traded services for votes and improved conditions in their cities somewhat. Social and cultural changes 1877 to 1900. American life seemed much the same in 1877 as it had been a century earlier. Most Americans were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who owned their own homes and led quiet, generally healthy lives. But urbanization and industrialization were challenging all aspects of American life. Manners and mores. The late 19th century was Victorian in its morals. Middle-class men and women dressed and behaved properly. Religious values were still strong and underlay many of the reform movements aimed against alcohol, pornography, and political corruption. Leisure and entertainment. In general, Americans spent their free time at home playing cards, croquet, or other popular games. The general taste in music favored sentimental ballads, but ragtime was becoming popular. Outside the home, the circus was immensely popular, and organized baseball, football, and basketball began to attract fans. Streetlights and streetcars changed Americans' leisure habits. Evening became a time for entertainment and pleasure. Changes in the family life. Family relationships changed dramatically under the impact of urbanization and industrialization. Among the poorly paid segments of society where everyone had to work, family life virtually disappeared. In the middle-class families, the move to suburbia meant that the father commuted to work in the morning and was gone all day. Many middle-class women who no longer earned an income concentrated upon making their homes a domestic refuge from the outside world. But domesticity was never fully honored, and it became almost shameful to be just a housewife. Changing views, a growing assertiveness among women. New women, those who established themselves in successful careers and who could support themselves, increasingly demanded the elimination of laws that discriminated against them and spoke openly about these topics. Educating the masses. Even though the states required young people to attend school, few students reached the 6th grade. Until reformers like John Dewey became accepted, most teaching was unimaginative and routine, and students were not usually encouraged to be active in the classroom. The educational problems of the South were compounded by segregation and rural poverty. In 1896, the Supreme Court allowed separate but equal school systems, thus approving racial discrimination. Higher education. Colleges and universities flourished thanks to aid from private sources and federal government. There was greater emphasis on practical subjects such as medicine and nursing, and great research institutions such as Johns Hopkins were opened. Women found it easier to get a college education, but African Americans and other racial minorities were usually confined to institutions like Tuskegee, only for blacks. African American leaders debated the future of higher education in a segregated society. Booker T. Washington argued that African Americans had to accommodate to racism and concentrate on practical, vocational education. W.E.B. Du Bois instead insisted that African Americans received equality and an integrated education. The strings of reform. The dominant idea among many intellectuals in the period was social Darwinism, which held that attempts at reform in society were useless and harmful. Nevertheless, some thoughtful people began to argue that conditions in the United States had to be changed. Progress and Poverty. One of the most influential books of the era was Henry George's Process and Poverty. George convinced many Americans that the rich were getting richer and the poor poorer. His solution was to tax land, which he believed was the source of all wealth. New currents in social thought. George was not the only reformer. The social gospel preached by liberal Protestant ministers was an attempt to reform industrial society by introducing Christian standards into the economic sphere. The settlement houses. Stanton Coit introduced London's settlement house idea into New York in 1886. The idea caught on, and settlement houses, mostly staffed by women, spread around the nation. The best known, Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, offered classical and practical education to those who lived in the slums. The settlement house movement inspired further reform and was influential in having a law passed in Illinois in 1893 that limited the number of hours that could be worked by children under the age of 14. A crisis in social welfare. The Depression of 1890